Hey guys, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to take a look at a couple years within baseball over the next couple videos and look at some interesting anomalies, little quick fact type things that I thought were really interesting and odd. Now, I know Foolish Baseball did a video similar to this one, but with Felix Hernandez and how he actually won it despite not winning many games. But I wanted to take a look at another year that had equal in misunderstanding with the Cy Young, but what seems to be for a bit of a different reason. So to start, the award that I wanted to look at was the AL Cy Young for 1993. Now in 1993, the Blue Jays beat the Phillies in 6 games in the World Series. So obviously it makes sense that they would have some pitchers that would be in the top Cy Young voting. However, the first place voter went to a Now, the Toronto Blue Jays beat the Phillies in 6 games in the World Series, so obviously they would have some pitching in the Cy Young voting. However, the winner was from the Chicago White Sox in Jack McDowell, who won 89% of the first place votes. What I wanted to look at was why he won and understanding that there probably should have been a different winner. In several cases, there were several people that should have won before him. Now, to start it off, I want to realize that the Chicago White Sox actually did make the postseason, and they faced the Jays in the ALCS at the time. They lost, obviously, but they were a reasonable foe. Now, with Jack McDowell having won the award, I wanted to look at some of his stats, and even looking at the next 2 players that were in the voting, he didn't compare to them other than one factor. And I wanted to take a look at why that factor mattered so much. So to start, he won 22 games. That was the biggest part of it all because none of the other people in the voting even won 20. Next closest being both Randy Johnson and Pat Henkin from Seattle and Toronto respectively with 19. However, every other stat is a little padded, and they're not nearly as good. So, for example, he had the most losses. That's not necessarily an important stat, but he did have the most losses. It would take up until the 6th person in the Cy Young voting to have a higher ERA than him. He had the highest ERA in the top 5, even though one of them actually is a reliever in Dwayne Ward. And things such as he had the highest innings pitched, but it was by 1 1/3 inning, so it wasn't by a lot. The only reason I can think of that he may have won was because he won 22 games, and he was on a division clinching team. If you look at some of the players below him, however, there should have been a definite change in voting. Randy Johnson in 2nd place had a much better ERA by .13. He had another extra game started. He had the same amount of complete games played. He had 1 less shutout. He even had a save. He let almost less than 100 hits than Jack McDowell. He had less runs, less earned runs, a couple more home runs, and he let a couple more walks. But that was because he was a bit of a flamethrower, so you can expect that to happen from time to time. But otherwise, most of his stats argue that he was much better. And even in the WAR category, Jack McDowell only had 4.4, and the top 4 people all had higher than him. So it doesn't make sense. Randy Johnson even had 6.6, so it wasn't by a small amount either. In 3rd place was Kevin Appier. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's what I'm going to assume. And he definitely could have the argument of being the best pitcher this year, other than obviously Greg Maddux had an incredible year in the National League. Kevin Appier had a ERA of 2.56, the only person that was a starter in the AL Cy Young voting that actually had a below 3 ERA, although Jimmy Key in 4th place had 3 flat. His 34 games started was basically a standard for most of the starters in the Cy Young voting, but the only difference was that he had less complete games and less shutouts. It wasn't by a enormous amount, but he did better, far, far better in almost every other category otherwise, including ERA. His WAR was over 9 with 9.3. His innings pitched were only about 20 less than Jack McDowell with 238.2. Had even less hits than Randy Johnson had, less runs with only 74, less earned runs with only 68. And the craziest thing was, despite being a starter, he had only 8 home runs given up. And now he let 81 walks, which was more than Jack McDowell, but less than Randy Johnson. So he was a good in-between guy. So he definitely looked like he would have a strong outing for a Cy Young vote and should have won it. However, he was on the Royals, and the Royals, if I can remember correctly, were not very high up in the rankings. They were third, and then the Mariners, with Randy Johnson, were fourth in the West Division, behind the Jack McDowell White Sox. Now, I think it's a little unfortunate for them to be behind him, despite being the superior pitchers, because although their teams didn't win it, they still went positive. They still had a relatively good year. So I think it was unfair for them to be put below. The fourth pitcher that was in the list was Jimmy Key for the New York Yankees, and they were in second place, right behind the Jays. Not right behind, but they were obviously being pretty competitive with it. He had a 3 flat ERA, like I said before, and he had slightly less of a WAR than Randy Johnson with only 6.3, but that's still far more than Jack McDowell had with just about 4.5. He had an incredible win-loss ratio compared to the rest with 750 because he won 18 and lost only 6. But the thing for him, again, that kind of shortcomes between Jack McDowell and Jimmy Key, is that he had less complete games and less shutouts. It wasn't... Obviously, this was a time when they were starting to slowly dwindle in the complete games, but they were still very, very important for a pitcher to use. And he had... Again, even more so, slightly less innings pitched with only 236 and 2/3. But he also let less hits than Jack McDowell, less runs, less earned runs. He had slightly more home runs with 26, but he was definitely a control artist as he only had 43 walks. I think it's kind of incredible that he did so well with that, despite being against some incredibly hard competition. A stat I want to look at for the top 4 players before going into the 5th, and that's the last one I'll go into because the other 2 I don't feel had quite as good of a chance, is I want to look at ERA plus and WHIP. Now, ERA plus kind of adjusts for ballparks, especially because they were all in the same year, so it's just based on their ballparks and how they did. Now, Jack McDowell, out of the top 4, and as I'll say later, in the top 5, had the worst ERA plus with only 125. 100 is league average. So he was definitely better than the average pitcher, but he was not a incredible dominant machine. Randy Johnson, the lowest of the top 5, other than Jack McDowell, still had a pretty dominant 135. And like I said before, I found that the Kevin Appier, again, I don't know if that's the wrong way to say it or not, he had an incredible ERA plus with 179, and then Jimmy Key with a 139. So they were all at least 10 points above, so that should mean something. And now, WHIP stands for walks plus hits in innings pitched. So say you had a hit an inning, so then it would be flat on 1. However, obviously that's very, very hard to do. And for Jack McDowell, it seemed the hardest to do out of the top 5 pitchers. He had a 1.286, nearly 1.3, which is still pretty decent, but it's not as dominant as you would expect from a Cy Young winner. And if you look at the next 3, none of them pass 1.12, because Randy Johnson has 1.112, and Jimmy Key has 1.107. Kevin Appier has 1.106. So it's very confusing for me, and especially because he wasn't even a strikeout artist either, because he has the lowest strikeouts by almost 20 than any other person. It does not make sense to me why Jack McDowell won the award, even with Randy Johnson getting over 300 strikeouts, which was incredible. The fifth and final person, which is the person who I actually believe should have won the award because he had an incredible season despite coming out of the bullpen, was Dwayne Ward from the Toronto Blue Jays. And this would even apply because of the winning factor that so many teams and so many voters loved. So Dwayne Ward from the Jays, obviously they won the World Series that year, and they won the year before. So they really had the voters' attention, and obviously in 6th and 7th place were also Blue Jays pitchers. So the last 3 of 7 were all Jays. Now, just listen to some of these stats to listen to how good he was in the bullpen. So just in the bullpen alone, he had 3 WAR. That's pretty unheard of. It's very hard to do. An ERA of 2.13, that's pretty Mariano Rivera-esque. He was in 71 games where he finished 70 of them and got 45 saves. Pitched 71 and 2/3 innings, so pretty much an inning a game that he started. He only allowed 49 hits, 17 runs, 17 earned runs, so all of them were his own. 4 home runs, 25 walks, 97 strikeouts. And that's incredible. And a whip of 1.033. That is phenomenal. And to top it all off, his ERA plus was 2.04, which means that he was above dominant. He was 2 times better than the average pitcher in the entire league. That seems pretty good to me. And despite being a reliever, there have been reliever Cy Young winners. There have been several. And I believe that Dwayne Ward should have been one. But in this case, unfortunately, it didn't come to be. He had an incredible usage. Unfortunately, it didn't come to be. And it didn't really matter anyway because he still got a World Series ring. And he only got 5 vote points. No first places. Neither did Jimmy Key. But he should have gotten something. He should have been, there should be a reliever award way back then, at the very least, because he was the most dominant reliever that year. And it's very unfortunate for them because several people should have beat out Jack McDowell. His year was not very good, not in comparison, not that it wasn't great by any means, but not nearly as good as the top 5. Now, I wouldn't say 6 and 7 deserve it because Pat Henkin and Juan Guzman both had a almost 4 ERA, and they had some things that I wasn't huge on, like their home run rates and their strikeouts weren't fantastic, stuff like that. Their whip, they were about average, but they were still on a winning team, so I can get why they got votes in the first place. But that's not how it was for Jack McDowell, because he just straight up won the thing, and although the Chicago White Sox won their division, they didn't win the World Series. They didn't even win the championship series. So I don't know why it would be seen upon that Jack McDowell should have won it. If they were going by the thought of winning, it should have been Dwayne Ward. And even by stats alone, it should have been him, or at the very least, Kevin Appier. Or if they were liking a name that was coming up, Randy Johnson. If you like this video, make sure to watch some more of my videos. Make sure to comment, like, share it, subscribe, do whatever you want to do. And make sure to keep watching for new videos as I'm trying to pump out a few more as they come. Unfortunately, with the season still being on the line, trying to figure out what I want to post. And hopefully I'll figure out some more stuff soon. But other than that, see you guys in the next video.